Welcome to this informative video on assessing an existing production or brownfield environment and some of the considerations for or prerequisites for deploying SD-WAN, okay? Some things that you need to consider in order to successfully push the SD-WAN overlay. Let's get started. Historically, a lot of our customers have done a phenomenal job of managing security policy from Panorama. So things that we typically associate with the device group policies and objects, right? They're managing the security policy and everything just fine. However, when we think about some of the networking items, interfaces, IP, zones, networking information, things of that nature, a lot of times that's been left local to the device. Well, Panorama is really the central orchestrator for all things SD-WAN, right? We're going to be pushing the configuration from Panorama. The plugin is going to be installed on Panorama. Panorama is really the brains of the operation. So one of the first things that we need to ensure is that we are managing that remote device holistically. So not only from a security policy perspective, but from a central perspective also, so that we have all of the components that we need from an interface, IP, zone, all that good stuff is on Panorama, which will enable us to successfully push the SD-WAN overlay, okay? That's one of the first main considerations. One of the next considerations is, are there any existing IPsec tunnels? Often, a lot of remote locations may connect back to hub/data centers via IPsec tunnels across the public internet. Well, we could potentially run into an issue there. And the issue becomes is PANOS does not support the termination of multiple IPsec tunnels on the same peer endpoints. So what I mean by this is if the existing connectivity from a remote location to a hub/data center, if they terminate on the same interfaces locally and at the remote end on which we're also looking to deploy SD-WAN, PANOS doesn't support it. That's the scenario right there where you're looking to deploy a second IPsec tunnel on peer endpoints when an existing IPsec tunnel is already deployed. So what we have to do there in order to successfully deploy SD-WAN, we need to delete that existing IPsec tunnel, okay? But in deleting that existing IPsec tunnel, there are things to take into consideration. One of the main things to take into consideration is the Panorama to manage device connectivity. How will that be affected? Oftentimes, if I'm connecting from a remote location back to a central hub/data center, well, that Panorama to manage device connectivity, that routing may be across that IPsec tunnel. Now, I don't want to delete that IPsec tunnel for the purposes of deploying SD-WAN, but at the same time, I'll lose connectivity. So just something to think about. Planning and preparation prior to deploying SD-WAN is key. Understand the existing Panorama to manage device connectivity. There are multiple ways, if that connectivity is across that IPsec tunnel, that we can overcome that. We can configure a GRE tunnel temporarily and force the Panorama and manage device connectivity, maybe that's /32 traffic, across that GRE tunnel temporarily while we delete the IPsec tunnel and deploy SD-WAN. Maybe we manage the remote device externally from the internet for a brief period. Maybe you have a dedicated management network and this is not even an issue. The point being, make sure you take into consideration what is that existing connectivity, the fact that if I'm deploying SD-WAN on an interface that currently has IPsec tunnels and peer endpoints, that has to be deleted, and how that affects my existing connectivity, okay? One of the other main considerations for SD-WAN is that all interfaces must be in the same zone. If I'm going to be deploying SD-WAN, they must be in the same zone. So for example, you can see here, Ethernet 1.1, 1.8, and 1.9. If I'm looking to deploy SD-WAN on these three interfaces, well, I can see that 1.1 is in the security zone outside, 1.8 is in the security zone outside. However, 1.9 is not. So we need to consider what's going on there. Being that we have to move that other interface to 1.9, that may need to take place during the outage window and so forth. Make sure we have that conversation with the customer and that we're accounting for any existing traffic flow and things of that nature so that we can successfully deploy SD-WAN, okay? And also talking about interfaces. There are some things which are not currently supported. Again, check your latest PANOS release, the PANOS release on which you're going to be deploying SD-WAN, and if it's supported, okay? Currently, when we talk about sub-interfaces or secondary IP addresses and things of that nature, that is not supported for SD-WAN. I just talked about this Ethernet 1.8 interface. you can see here that I have a secondary IP address on this interface. That's going to take some communication and conversing with the customer to understand what exactly is the functionality of that secondary IP address. Maybe it's cosmetic, maybe it's for an ISP NAT pool or something of that nature. However, if the next hop ISP is routing that subnet to the firewall, we still shouldn't have any issue. The point being, understand what is going on. And if secondary IP addresses are configured, if we have sub interfaces that are configured, then that is not currently supported by SD-WAN. Make sure you check the PANOS software version of which you're going to be deploying to make sure that if this feature is now supported or if it isn't. The SD-WAN plugin is key. Okay, the SD-WAN plugin is really the brains of the operation and is a prerequisite for deploying SD-WAN. So as we install the SD-WAN plugin on Panorama and build out our devices and VPN clusters, make sure that any functionality that you need is supported by the PANOS version. Full mesh being one of them, okay? It was introduced in 10.0. So just make sure that whatever the PANOS version and your plugin version also supports any features that the customer may need. Maybe they need a feature that was introduced in 10.0, something like full mesh or DIA anypath, forward error correction, packet duplication, things of this nature, which weren't necessarily supported in 9.1, okay? So make sure that your current PANOS version and that the SD-WAN plugin version support the features that you are going to need to successfully deploy SD-WAN, okay? Then I think the last consideration that we need to think about is existing routing, okay? If we look at it, customers in a brownfield scenario may have existing routing. Well, we know for SD-WAN, for the purposes of SD-WAN, that BGP is used 90% of the time. The only options that we currently have when pushing the SD-WAN overlay is BGP and static routing. Therefore, if we're going to be deploying BGP and BGP is already deployed in a customer environment, let's make sure that we understand what's going on there. What are the router IDs that they're using? How about the AS numbers that they're using? Our implementation only of SD-WAN only supports the use of private ASs. Is that currently in play? Is there any BGP configuration which would prohibit us from successfully merging our SD-WAN configuration into the existing BGP topology or anything of that nature that would break anything or prevent route propagation and things of that nature? If the existing BGP routing is in play, make sure that we understand intimately what's going on there, that we understand the AS numbers, and that we understand route propagation so that once the SD-WAN overlay is in play, the same traffic flow remains, okay? And the only other thing that I will call out to conclude this is QoS. Be mindful of QoS. Especially when pushing the SD-WAN overlay, you're going to end up with X number of IPsec tunnels. And how does that affect the existing QoS configuration from a tunnel traffic and a clear text traffic perspective? Is the QoS implementation, is it still needed post SD-WAN deployment? Just make sure that you understand any existing QoS profiles which may be in play and apply to interfaces on which SD-WAN is going to be deployed and how that could potentially affect tunnel or clear text traffic.